This is BBC News. I'm Regid Ahmed. Our top stories. Heavy security as Mexicans head for the polls after one of the most violent campaigns in the country's history. Flags are rising and so are tensions as Hong Kong marks 21 years since its handover to China. Hundreds of thousands have taken to the streets as protests against US immigration policies spread coast to coast. And game over for Messi and Ronaldo. Argentina out, Portugal sent packing. The first day of the World Cup knockouts. Hello and welcome to BBC World News. Well, Mexicans go to the polls later to choose a new president as well as hundreds of lawmakers and politicians. The front-runner for president is the left-wing former mayor of Mexico City, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. But the campaign has seen some of the worst political violence in the country for decades. In a campo in the western state of Michoacán, the entire local police force was arrested after a candidate for mayor was murdered, as Will Grant reports. Of course, there's much more on our website on those upcoming elections. Now, Hong Kong is marking the 21st anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China with a flag-raising ceremony. But thousands of people in the territory are expected to take to the streets shortly for an annual protest march as tensions continue to simmer over the financial hub's democratic future. Let's get more on this from our correspondent Martin Yip, who's in Hong Kong for us. Martin, these anniversaries, when they're commemorated, how big an event are they still in Hong Kong 21 years later?
Well, it's the sort of odd year anniversary, you may say. It's not like last year when we had so many celebrations across the year that was the 20th anniversary. This year is relatively calm as for now. Say, for example, the flag raising ceremony this morning, it went over pretty smooth. But then I'm not saying that it will be a small ceremony anyway. Because in the afternoon, you may argue it's not part of the government's act, but the pro-Beijing camp is going to organize a major exhibition in Victoria Park to show off the so-called Bay Area concept promoted by President Xi Jinping. And that will be pretty much back-to-back in terms of venue with the pro-democracy rally starting point.
The one country, two systems principle in Hong Kong, is that still very much in place?
Well, at least the pro-democracy camp has been arguing about that, especially with the recent passing of the piece of legislation that would allow mainland Chinese police officers, immigration officers and custom officers to operate at the West Kowloon high-speed railway terminus. Now, the arguing point is whether that kind of arrangement, having these policemen to work just within the terminus, constitutes executing mainland Chinese law on Hong Kong soil. Pro-democracy camps say so, but to the pro-Beijing camp, they have designated that part of area to be part of mainland China anyway, so that's nothing to do with one country, two system.
Presumably these protests that we're expecting will be a bit of an indication on how some people feel in Hong Kong about the system. What's the mood today? What's the atmosphere there as we wait for those protests to start?
Well, calm might really be the word for now, at least because even before today, there were some pro-democracy legislators who've been telling local press the past year is a relatively harmonic year between them and the Carrie Lam's government, while they still see those rulings, those sentences against those activists involved in the umbrella movement as well as the Mongkok protests as political persecution, while the government emphasized that's only the expression of rule of law. So what would happen this afternoon may be if there are people who are so upset with those rulings, they might be just coming out to join the rally, but we just don't know the size because we can't forget the sort of increasing size, apparently, for those who are in support of the rather radical camps.
All right, Martin Yip in Hong Kong, thank you very much for that. And we will keep you across that story, especially as those demonstrations get underway a bit later on. Now, from coast to coast, in major cities and small towns, hundreds of thousands of Americans have come out to protest against Donald Trump's immigration policies. Protesters have been calling for migrant families split up at the US border to be reunited. The rallies were organised before Mr. Trump ordered an end to the widely criticised zero-tolerance policy of separating children from their parents. But most of those 2,300 children are yet to be reunited with their families. Chris Buckler has been speaking to protesters in Washington. Let's get to some of the day's other news now. One of the junior partners in Germany's coalition government, the CSU, is meeting later to discuss whether Chancellor Angela Merkel's plans to tighten controls on immigration go far enough. Disagreements over immigration have threatened the stability of the coalition for several weeks. Mrs. Merkel recently secured an immigration deal with leaders of the EU, but it's not clear how the plan will be implemented. At least one person has been killed and around a dozen injured during a march in the Nicaraguan capital, Managua, in memory of the young protesters who died over more than 2 months of anti-government protests. Rights groups reported armed men shooting at marchers during the demonstration. The militant Islamist group Al-Shabaab has banned single-use plastic bags in areas under its control in Somalia. According to media outlets affiliated with the group, the militants consider plastic bags a serious threat to the well-being of both humans and animals. Al-Shabaab did not say how it would implement the ban, but because of widespread fear of the group's use of violence, orders are usually followed. The Sri Lankan Navy is to move to a port leased to a state-run Chinese firm. After the end of the civil war, Sri Lanka borrowed billions of dollars from China to implement major infrastructure projects, including the Hambantota port. But last year, in lieu of the debt, Sri Lanka agreed to give China a majority stake in the port. Talks aimed at stopping the fighting between government forces and rebels in southern Syria have ended in failure. The opposition forces were attempting to negotiate a ceasefire with the government's Russian allies in order to stop a major offensive by Syrian military forces in Deraa province, which is near the border with Jordan. But rebels have reportedly rejected what they called a humiliating demand to surrender. Bill Hayton reports. Now, this is a story that's really captured attention in Thailand. A search for 12 young boys and their football coach trapped in a flooded cave has entered its 9th day. Rescue teams have been trying to reach deeper into the chambers of the Tam Luang cave in the hope of finding the children, who are all aged between 11 and 16. Well, despite working round the clock and with international assistance, there has been no contact with the group since they were reported missing, and monsoon rains have complicated the rescue by blocking passageways. A slight improvement in the weather on Sunday has raised hopes that divers will be able to reach deeper into the recesses of the cave complex. Would you stay with us on BBC World News? Still to come. It's game over for Argentina and Portugal after losses on the first day of the World Cup knockouts. Messi and Ronaldo among the heavyweights heading home. This is BBC World News, the latest headlines. Heavy security as Mexicans head for the polls after one of the most violent campaigns in the country's history. And events are taking place to mark 21 years since Britain handed Hong Kong back to China. There's been a flag-raising ceremony, but pro-democracy protests are expected shortly. Well, in Myanmar, authorities have told the BBC they've started to welcome back some of the 700,000 Rohingya Muslims driven from their homes by military crackdown last year. But there are doubts over just how many people have actually returned, and grave fears for the safety of any Rohingya who do travel back. The UN says what happened in northern Rakhine State was a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Journalists are normally banned from the area, but our Myanmar correspondent Nick Beek managed to get there and sent this special report. Let's go to the World Cup now, football, and Saturday saw two of the greatest players in the history of the game crash out within a few hours of each other. Argentina's Lionel Messi and Portugal's Cristiano Ronaldo both lost in the first knockout stage as France and Uruguay moved on to the quarterfinals. The BBC's Tim Allman watched the action. Well, two more games take place on Sunday. Let's see who's playing whom. First up, the hosts Russia take on Spain in Moscow's Luzhniki Stadium. And the second game is happening in Nizhny Novgorod, and that's between Croatia and Denmark. Now, the hosts have been one of the surprise packages in this World Cup. Not many predicted they'd get out of their group, but now they're facing Spain. So is the pressure on? Head coach of Russia there. Now to Ghana, where funerals are a big deal, so much so that some people make a living by being paid to attend them, despite never knowing the person who's died. Their role, they say, is to use their tears to help those at the funeral let out their own. And that piece was all about the rather nuanced role of professional mourners in Ghana. Well, much more coming up on BBC World News, but you can catch me on Twitter. I'm at Regid Ahmed BBC. Of course, much more on our website, bbc.com/news, including all of what's coming up on the World Cup.